And now we'd like to welcome Captain William J. Toady, United States Navy retired. William Toady is a business executive, photographer, and author who served more than 26 years on active duty in the United States Navy. In the Navy, Captain Toady commanded Fleet Anti-Submarine Warfare Command Norfolk, served as Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3, and as commanding officer of the nuclear fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis. He also served for more than 9 years in the Pentagon, including tours as Special Assistant to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, as Navy Representative to the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, and as Deputy Director of the Navy War Plan Cell, Deep Blue. In 2012, he was a member of the White House Roundtable on Military Credentialing and Information Technology in support of President Obama's initiative to help service members receive civilian credentials and licenses. He's an honorary survivor of the World War II cruiser USS Indianapolis, and his narrative describing his experiences during the September 11, 2001 attack on the Pentagon were incorporated into the book Operation Homecoming. He's been featured in several global release documentaries related to 9/11 and recently authored a book titled From CO to CEO, a practical guide for transitioning from military to industry leadership, slated for publication in 2022. In industry, he's held executive positions at Raytheon, Hewlett-Packard, Cubic, and L3 Technologies, and he currently serves as President and CEO of Sparton Corporation in DeLeon Springs, Florida. Please join me in welcoming Captain Toady.
Thank you, Lisa, for that kind and too long introduction. But I want to thank Kathy and Terry for coming up here and having the bravery to speak about their son. And what sacrifice, what an incredible, inspiring story. In the face of such tragedy, what an important lesson for us all. I'm honored to speak here today. For over 2 decades, I've been trying to uphold a promise to keep the memory alive as well of a crew of one of the greatest warships of World War II, Uss Indianapolis the Cruiser. You may recall the story of Uss Indianapolis from the movie Jaws. After carrying the Hiroshima bomb from Mare Island, California to Tinian Island, it was sunk by a Japanese submarine on July 30th, 1945. The crew spent almost 5 days in the water waiting to get rescued, surviving deprivation and shark attacks. When they were finally picked up, only 316 out of a crew of 1,200 were still alive. Since I was captain of the submarine USS Indianapolis, it was my great honor to get to know nearly 200 of those great heroes. Sadly, only 4 of them are still alive today. But those decades ago, I committed to them all to tell their story every chance I got. Some years ago, one of those survivors, a great friend of mine named Glenn Morgan, called me up and said, "Bill, do you believe in free speech?" "Of course I do, Glenn," I said. He said, "Well, good, because I'm going to ask you to give a free speech." That was pure Glenn. What he was asking me to do was speak at the Iwo Jima reunion in Wichita Falls, Texas. As Glenn explained it, every year at the Iwo Jima reunion, quite understandably, they would feature someone who would talk about the Marine Corps role in the battle. You can understand that. And he said some of the Navy vets wanted somebody to say something about what the Navy did at Iwo Jima, and he was asking me to do that. Honestly, I was worried I'd had nothing worthwhile to say, but for some reason I agreed to do it anyway. I thought about the various stories I could tell about service and sacrifice during the battle. There are thousands of them. But I settled on the role of the 300 sailors, mostly underwater demolition team frogmen, the precursor of today's Navy SEALs, who surveyed the beach at Iwo before the Marines landed. Ernie Pyle once described those men as half fish and half nuts. Under a continuous barrage of artillery and mortar fire, these brave men suffered horrific casualties. Over 2/3 of them were killed or wounded by the end of the day. Let that sink in. 2 out of every 3 frogmen became casualties, a story that has been substantially underreported over the years. I have to tell you that after worrying that I would have anything meaningful to say, I was very proud of this speech. That was right up to the point I arrived at the reunion to actually give the speech when Glenn said, "Hey, have you met the guy who's going to talk about the Marine Corps during the Iwo Jima?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Come here." He walks me up to a gentleman in a scarlet sports coat and said, "Bill, let me introduce you to Woody Williams." Now, in case you don't know, Woody Williams is a Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of Iwo Jima. So I had been set up to talk about Iwo Jima across from a Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of Iwo Jima. My heart sunk. I could still hear Glenn chuckling as he saw the look on my face. He's no longer with us, and he is sorely missed. Woody Williams, on the other hand, is still alive. But I'd like for us to ponder on this for a moment. Think about the sacrifice of all of our World War II veterans and all of the veterans who've been asked to endure so much since then. Nothing I went through during my 26 years on active duty could be compared with any of that. Yes, I endured 7 submarine deployments, but if I'm going to be honest with you, when you're deploying in a submarine and you can't communicate with anybody because you're underwater and you're in one of those areas you can't admit being in, the families suffer as much or more as the sailors that are on that submarine. For me, my many years of struggle on submarine duty were not as bad as the several hours of struggle on one particular day. The worst day of my life began on a sunny, otherwise pleasant morning while I was at work in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. Moments after American Airlines Flight 77 slammed into my building and I realized it had not killed me, my Navy training kicked in. Navy veterans here today will realize there are no rescue squads on Navy ships at sea. The crew is the rescue squad. Sailors are trained to run to the scene of a casualty, which is what I did a few minutes after we were hit. When I arrived at the point of impact with a dozen or so other mostly military first responders, I did what I could to help people escape the conflagration. We succeeded with some, but tragically failed with others. It's not my purpose here today to replay the events of 9/11 since they're so well known to this audience. Many of my friends died that day, but for some reason I did not. When something like that happens to you, you can't help but wonder why you were spared when so many others weren't. It took years for me to make peace with how this played out, but I eventually did. Veterans like many of you in this audience know there may come a time when you will be asked to make the ultimate sacrifice. That comes with the job. In the military, we believe that if and when your number comes up, it will be on the field of battle or when you're deployed. None of us think about the possibility that our time may come when we're at our desks on what we in the Navy call shore duty. But that's the world we live in today. It's not a world with defined front lines. It's a world where the front line tomorrow could be in your backyard. Veterans who served after 9/11 have a great deal in common with vets who served decades before. Like the veterans from Vietnam, Korea, and the World Wars, our global war on terror vets, like Kathy and Terry here have just pointed out, have endured so much sacrifice. Let's talk for a moment about that concept, sacrifice. Thousands of civilians, non-combatants, sacrificed their entire futures on 9/11. And thousands more veterans like Terry and Kathy's sons, have paid the ultimate sacrifice since then. And yet, the concept of sacrifice has become alien to most Americans. It seems to be limited to a very small percentage of our population, mostly veterans. But it wasn't always that way. In history class, we learned that during World War II, President Roosevelt gave a speech titled A Call for Sacrifice, where he outlined conditions he believed everyday Americans would have to endure to allow us to win that terrible war. And everyday Americans complied. While our veterans were off fighting, folks back home engaged in rubber drives, steel drives, planted victory gardens, endured rationing of almost everything. They bought war bonds. They did whatever they needed to do to help win the war. Things back home softened a bit during the Korean conflict. But during Vietnam, and I'm old enough to remember, things changed. Many Americans used the fact that they didn't support the war as an excuse to argue that they should not be required to sacrifice for it. Except for those veterans who were volunteered or were drafted, there wasn't much sacrifice going on during Vietnam. If anything, the ethos during that time was one of hedonism. One could argue that this was because so many believed we shouldn't be there in the first place. So be it. But after 9/11, things were different. That day was my generation's Pearl Harbor. We were attacked, and on September 12th, 2001, we came together like no other time since December 8th, 1941. And if I have one regret about how our leadership responded after 9/11, it is that we failed to leverage that unity by making the point that we all needed to sacrifice to overcome our new common enemy. Unless you were somebody who joined up the fight in the global war on terror, as Kathy and Terry's sons did, the nation was essentially unchanged. Nobody was asked to sacrifice. Oh, people were kind to their veterans. Folks began to say, "Thank you for your service," something that would never have happened during Vietnam. But it was as if saying, "Thank you for your service" became a substitute for actual sacrifice. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a wonderful thing to hear. But I, for one, became a little unsettled about this because it was too easy. It was too cute. It was as if the nice sentiment absolved people from actually having to do something meaningful to help us in our struggle against terrorism. It was pleasant, but far from sufficient. The truth is that the nation's sacrifice was fully borne on the back of its veterans, while everyone else continued to enjoy their latte. Sacrifice is such an alien concept to most Americans these days that last year, as we struggled through this pandemic, when we didn't know how bad it was going to be, millions of Americans pushed back against the minor inconvenience of wearing a mask to keep others free from the infection. If wearing a mask is too much sacrifice in modern times, what does that say about the more substantial sacrifices that prior generations had to make, or future generations might have to make? One of the best lines ever written for a movie was written for the Tom Hanks character in Saving Private Ryan. A number of soldiers were killed in that movie trying to save the Matt Damon character, when a dying Tom Hanks pulls Matt Damon towards him and says, "Earn this. Earn this." Thousands of veterans, including Kathy and Terry's sons, have died in the last 20 years to keep us free from terrorism, some in operations, but more due to suicide. They willingly made the ultimate sacrifice for us. Have we earned this? I worry that we haven't. And knowing this, I worry for future generations. Because if history teaches us anything, it teaches us that we struggle to learn any lessons from history. Let us earn this, starting today.